The Curse of Karrit Poor, being the reminiscences of Dr. Edmund Chinnery, RCVS. 1. A Mysterious Summons. As I write, the new century is scarcely begun. It is the age of invention, of the electric light, the motor car, and the gentleman's combination shoe and sock. The old queen is dead. It seems impertinent, of course, to refer to him as such, but Dr. Timothy Majolica was always the old queen to us in our student days, and it was he who led directly to my involvement in the narrative which I am about to unfold. A story so fantastic it might seem to have sprung from the ravings of some brain-fevered Eastern mystic. Or a twat. In the winter of 1852, I was still a young man, recently matriculated from the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, and looking to establish myself in practice. At that time, I was sharing rooms with an old college friend, Shankly Jackpot, a bohemian soul, who, at that time, was earning a living as a wrestler or female impersonator. I could never remember which. My degree was a good one, and yet I confess to finding myself disappointed at the paucity of advertised situations. I'd even considered employment as a resident vet at the Happy Glue Pot, a retirement home for shire horses, when I received one of my former tutor's enigmatic telegrams. "Come and see me tomorrow if you like, if you've not got much on." About 3 would be all right. Well, any time really, or next week. I'm free. Cheers. T.N. "Not quite as enigmatic as usual," commented Jackpot archly. Unperturbed, I took the train to Cambridge, and soon found myself back amongst the cloisters which I had been so recently and happily ensconced. It was a glorious day, and the winter sun dazzled over the slate roofs of the colleges like spit. When I arrived, Dr. Majolica was saying good-bye to one of the boys from the poor school. He would regularly invite these boys to his rooms for tea and private Greek tuition. As I entered, he gave me a ready smile, and passing his latest charge on the head, sending him back to the classroom with a twist of sherbet, a copy of Euclid, and a whispered, "Tell anybody about this, and I will fucking kill you." Puzzled by this last remark, I was on the point of saying something when Dr. Majolica threw himself down onto his sofa and began to fill his pipe from the toe end of the old pair of tights in which he kept his strongest tobacco. He gazed at me with the intensity which my fellows and I had come to know so well. "You have put on a little weight, Chinnery," he remarked with a smile. I shook my head. "Yes, I fancy you have. I also observed that you travelled from town today in a four-wheeler, that your driver was a dwarf lascar with old shoes not long discharged from the Welsh Fusiliers, and that you sat opposite a bachelor typist from Altrincham, who wore a greasy hat and had recently anointed his thinning hair with chocolate. You ate a full breakfast of eggs, bacon, sausages, and paper, which you washed down with a thimble full of blood." He sucked on his pipe and clapped his hands together. I trust nothing has escaped me. I could only shake my head in wonder, for he had erred in every respect. "I have in fact lost over 2 stones in weight, sir," said I. "After contracting the trots over summer, I came to Cambridge by train and sat alone. I can't stand eggs, and certainly wouldn't—" "Yes, all right, he said testily, his face falling. Hastily, he refilled his pipe and made a show of tidying some special photographic plates which were his hobby. I reflected once again that although my tutor was a first-rate veterinarian, as an analytical reasoner, he was shit. Over tea, he told me of a vacancy which he had heard of in the firm of Boothby, Canker, and Purblind. "Mr. Boothby is an elderly gentleman," Majolica explained, "and in poor health. But I have some little acquaintance with the other partners. If you like, I can put in a good word for you." I was naturally thrilled, and accepted Dr. Majolica's kind offer, only demurring at his suggestion that I might want to come into his dark room and look at some pictures of naughty people. "And where is this practice?" I asked my old mentor thinly. "It is in the North Country, he said at last. A charming little place called Royston Vasey. The Man on the Train. The day on which I travelled north was a cold one, and I had several times to wipe away a rime of frost from the carriage window. The train huffed and puffed like a pig with asthma, meandering over a bleak landscape of skeletal trees and frozen waterways. Occasionally I spotted a sheep or a huddle of cows in the lower end of the field, and I smiled to myself, thinking about how soon I would have my arm thrust up them, probing for tumours or expediting difficult pregnancies. The train had just pulled out of yet another lonely station when the door of my compartment was drawn aside. I looked up and saw an extraordinary figure, swarthy and with his left ear pierced for rings. He sported a battered top hat and eye patch. With his barrel chest and sinewy neck, he could have been taken for a natural athlete, were it not for the complete absence of arms and legs. "How do?" he called brightly, as he was thrown bodily into the carriage by the station master. He thanked the man for his trouble, and then shuffled past my legs. With an effort, he managed to wriggle his way onto the opposite seat and rolled himself a cigarette, using only his leathery tongue. "Edmund Chinnery," I said by way of introduction. "I am Kinky John," he said solemnly. "Might I have something for you?" So saying, he bit open his coat, revealing rows and rows of vegetables which were attached to the lining. I frowned. Kinky John laughed. "I expect these things is a bit saucy for you, with your towny ways." "What do you mean?" I replied with some asperity. He fondled the nearest vegetable with unhealthy tenderness. "The leek, the potato, the red cabbage, and his white cousin. These are things that a fine gentleman such as yourself feigns disinterest in." "I'm sorry?" "Shut away in your ivory tower with your London ways, pretending you is so respectable when you and your kind brood on such things as these, and go a-visiting your special places to satisfy these forbidden desires." "Desires for vegetables?" I queried, for his tone had nettled me. Kinky John nodded. "Some call 'em that, aye." He lapsed into silence. I coughed and drew my greatcoat tighter around me. "Well, I hope that your country ways may be more familiar to me soon, Kinky John. I am on my way to Royston Vasey." The freakish fellow paused from stroking his cheek against the bulb of a Spanish onion. "Vasey?" he gasped. "Why?" "I am to be interviewed for the position of assistant veterinary surgeon in the firm of Boothby, Canker and Purblind." Kinky John looked at me for a long moment, and then gently manoeuvred the onion back into his coat. "Tell me this, sir," he murmured. "With whom is your appointment to be kept?" "It is with Mr. Purblind," I replied. "His youngest partner is away in town, and I gather Mr. Boothby is not a well man." My strange companion nodded. "No, that he ain't." Again, we fell silent. A moment later, the train drew into another station. "This is me, blacked up," announced Kinky John, rolling off the upholstery and struggling slug-like towards the door. "Royston Vasey's just one more stop." I thanked him for his companionship, but there was more to come. He leant down towards his lapel and managed to drag something from his pocket with his teeth. He tossed it into the air, and I caught it deftly. "Take this," he said. I examined the object. "A beetroot." He nodded. "The nights are awful cold and lonely." I slipped the vegetable into my waistcoat and fell back astonished as Kinky John launched himself at me, landing in my lap like a monkey, or a man who might as well have been a sock. "For the love of God, Dr. Chinnery," he gasped, "stay away from Royston Vasey. Get the first train back to Chicago, London, whatever. Get away from here, and don't think no more of Boothby, Canker and Purblind." So saying, he tumbled from my lap and out of the train. It can be easily imagined that Kinky John's warning left me with a feeling of deep unease. It took me fully 5 minutes to realise it was caused by the beetroot sticking into my tummy. 3. An appointment in Royston Vasey. Royston Vasey appeared much as I imagined it. A small, fairly prosperous settlement with the usual quota of shops and civic buildings. A memorial on the main street commemorated those townsfolk who had fallen in war. On close inspection, however, I was surprised to see that over 150 Vaseyites had apparently perished in the American War of Independence as a consequence of catching the wrong boat on a day trip to the Isle of Man. I soon found the practice of Boothby, Canco and Purblind, and was made welcome by the latter. A pleasant-seeming individual with a wooden eye, who looked over my credentials with evident satisfaction. The upshot was, I was offered the position at once, and I thanked him profusely. "There is only one thing," said Mr. Purblind at length. "Mr. Boothby is an invalid. He never stirs from his bed from dawn till dusk, save to go to a wee. He occupies the last room on the 3rd floor. The door is green baize, studded with sequins. You cannot miss it. You wish me to visit him, then?" Purblind's expression darkened. "On no account," he almost hissed. His voice softened, and he removed his wooden eye, polishing it on his jumper. "Mr. Boothby is a very sick man, and the slightest disturbance is abhorrent to him. Any attempt to break this instruction will render you liable to immediate dismissal. Do I make myself clear?" "Perfectly." Mr. Purblind smiled. "Capital. I think we shall get along very well." That night, I slept fitfully. I was awoken between 2 and 3 in the morning by a terrible sound. At first, I took it to be the wailing of a cat outside the casement, but with a shudder, I realised that it came from within the house. In fact, it must have come from the room above my own. With a thrill of horror, I knew that it was the room with the green baize door and the sequins. I held the beetroot tight. The sound came again, a fearful caterwauling, as though a soul were in dreadful torment. I thought of Mr. Purblind's warning, but how could I ignore this poor old man's distress? And with a heavy heart, I lit a candle and made my way out onto the landing. I crept across the bare boards and swiftly made my way across the stairs. In the flaring light of the candle, I saw the green baize door at the end of the gloomy corridor, sequins twinkling. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin sliver of light was peeking through from the room beyond. With a final glance around me, I pushed it open and went inside. 4. The Terrible Tale of Magnus Boothby. On a bed, almost lost in a miasma of pillows, lay what I assumed to be Mr. Boothby. He was a tiny, etiolated, shriveled-up thing, more like something I would discard from the dissecting room than a man. He still was a man, of course, but sort of horrible, like a baby lamb in its birth sack, or an old pear. Suddenly his eyes sprang open, dark, tiny eyes they were, like 2 flies in rice pudding. He beckoned to me, and gingerly I advanced. "Mr. Boothby?" I stammered. He inclined his head a fraction. His hair and beard were wispy and white, like semen in the bath. "I am Magnus Boothby," he croaked. "Are you the new boy?" I introduced myself, and the ancient creature nodded slowly. "Did they tell you you mustn't come in here?" "Indeed, sir, but you sounded in such distress." "Distress?" Boothby let out a high-pitched laugh. "This term does not do justice to my condition," he said, his voice as dry as paper. "I am accursed." I sat down on the edge of the bed. What on earth could he mean? "You would not think it to look at me now, Dr. Chinnery, but I was once a young and handsome fellow." "When?" I asked. "Well, a long time ago." I shrugged. "Well, we all have to get old." He shook his head impatiently. "I know that. I'm trying to say that I'm old beyond my years. My life has been blighted, twisted out of shape by the forces of darkness." "I see."
Have you ever heard of Karrit?" he asked.
"The cricketer?" Mr. Boothby closed his eyes and sighed.
"It is a province of India. I was stationed there at Roy Castle as chief veterinary surgeon. I was much loved. My practice flourished, treating everything from the sacred cows to the mesmer bees' pampered dogs."
I nodded.
Now, the Maharaja of Karrit had a favourite pet, a little monkey named Topov. I had often wondered if the Maharaja would favour me with a call, but none came, until that fateful afternoon. Oh, woe!
I calmed the old man down. He clasped my hand with his own. It was dry and gnarled like a twig, or like the hand of a very, very old man.
"My only vice," continued Boothby with a whisper, "was drink, and I fear I was absolutely blooded that day, for I had been celebrating the successful treatment of an outbreak of bovine verrucas in a sacred herd. The message came that Topov the monkey was very sick, with a delicate condition which couldn't be described in writing, and would the English veterinary sahib please honour the Maharaja with a consultation. I hastened from the castle to the palace, and saw at once that it was indeed a matter of some delicacy. Topov was known to be a cheeky monkey with an overactive libido, who enjoyed the simulation of coitus with almost anything that came to hand. On this occasion, he found himself in a compromising position with the Maharaja's ornamental pencil sharpener, fashioned in the shape of a large ivory elephant. With utmost tact, I assured the anxious Maharaja that the little fellow could be freed with the simple application of ordinary Vaseline. I reached for the pot in my case, together with a spatula, and applied a circular smear of the substance around the root of Topov's genital cluster. Despite my inebriation, I was pleased with my handiwork, as was the Maharaja, who promised me riches beyond my wildest dreams, a place by the Ganges, and the hand of his beautiful daughter, plus the rest of her if I was interested. But what was this? The little monkey was shrieking, clearly in agony. A plume of what looked like steam was issuing from the back end of the ivory elephant, where it conjoined with the monkey's hips. I struggled to focus on the jar of ointment in my hand. What I saw made me blanch with fear, for it was not Vaseline that I held, but 16 ounces of Buller's full-strength bovine verruca acid, which, even as I read the label, was eating its way through the root of Topov's unfortunate member. The poor creature pulled himself free and skittered pell-mell across the floor, expiring in a steaming heap of simian anguish. The tripartite genital disjecta membrae flopped onto the floor, and the thud went as a dagger to my heart. The Maharaja stared at me.
Boothby let out an anguished howl.
"Never have I seen such a look on a human face," he croaked. "Sometimes on a cow's and once on a gorilla's, yes, but this..." The Maharaja swore he would be revenged. He picked up Topov's little jewels, and holding them aloft, he called upon his gods.
At that, the old man opened the front of his nightshirt. For an instant, I thought I understood why Mr. Purblind had warned me not to go into his room. But then I noticed that around Boothby's neck was a small, shriveled object, like an amulet or a rabbit's foot, but most of all like the burnt-off bollocks of an Indian monkey.
"Topov's parts!"
I ejaculated. Boothby nodded.
"Touch them and see."
I did not want to, I swear, but something seemed to compel me to touch the damned furry things. My fingers closed around them, and at once I felt a strange sensation steal over me. I looked down at Boothby, and to my unutterable horror, I found he was laughing.
"Free!" he chortled. "Free at last!"
I knew at once that something was terribly wrong.
Free? I whispered hoarsely. Free to do what?
Boothby threw back the bed covers and staggered back out onto the floorboards.
Free to practice veterinary medicine. Free to pat a puppy on the head. Free to give a gerbil an enema with minimal risk.
I don't understand, I managed to say, because I didn't understand. At that moment, the door opened and Purblind came dressed in his pyjamas.
Is it over then, Magnus?
He asked, grinning like a demon.
Is the curse lifted?
Curse?
What curse? I all but screamed.
Boothby turned towards me, cackling in triumph.
The Maharaja's curse, that any animal I touch would meet a dreadful end. A vile, terrible curse. And to be honest, absolute professional death for a vet.
And I have lifted the curse? Purblind nodded.
By taking it upon yourself. For years we have waited, and then your old tutor told us about you, Chinnery. He said that you were just the kind of well-meaning imbecile who would fit in with our plans. Another vet has touched the monkey's bits, and now you and all your descendants will suffer the curse of Karrit Paw. And I can move to Harrogate, cried Boothby,
with which rather baffling comment he and Purblind left the room. I was alone, betrayed by my former friend, and stitched up rotten by my new employers. I threw the dreadful cock and balls into the corner of the room and reached inside my nightshirt for Kinky John's lucky beetroot. Amongst the roots I found a dead weevil. Of course I could have squashed it in my sleep, but I knew at once that its lifeless carcass told a different and more dreadful story.